we're going to continue looking at the seating or sitting furniture items that we made previously. We set it up as a furniture item, but what we didn't do, well, what we did was assign some very basic materials to it. So today we're going to set these up properly to have materials that we can then paint inside Blender. So we're going to hand paint some very basic textures. So this is our furniture item. It's all set up. We already assigned some very basic materials to this. So let's go to the outline now, the way that we set this up for TikTok. So there are our materials. So we set up the meshes so that they were separate. It's not joined into a single mesh, as you can do, that's optional. And this just makes it easier to manage and then subsequently texture. And then once this is uploaded to IMVU, it then makes it easier to derive from. So it keeps everything separate. So the option when we create our furniture item is to join everything together into a single mesh or keep everything separate, because the FBX format allows us to export multiple meshes at the same time. So we've got material 1, that's book 1. So we've given them the IMVU compatible material names. So that's a label, in this case that's book, and then 1, that's for the mesh. Book, and then space, square brackets, the number that identifies the material for IMVU. So that's 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to however many, 999 or however many there are that you can max out on. So that's 1, that's 2, and the seat itself is 0. So these have just got very basic color assignments. So what we need to do now is go into the shading workspace. And this could get tricky because of the layout. So we need to go into the shading workspace to assign some images to each of these materials. So click. Oh, yeah, that's going to be a bit squished. So let's just move those to the side. And that's the side. So there's our first object. These are the basic nodes. So if you're not familiar with this within Blender, so this is the preview. So this is the 3D view. And this is our material editor, essentially the node editor. And we create or construct materials by dropping in different types of nodes that correspond to a certain aspect of our material. So we want to add an image to this. So what we do is go into the add menu, click on that, and we want texture, image texture. So texture, image texture. Click on that and it'll give us this little node that follows the mouse. All we need to do is just click and drop that into place. So we've got two options. We can either create a brand new procedural, which is a temporary texture, or we can load in an actual image that we might already have. So let's have a quick look, see what we've got. Those are going to be small, so we want something that is let's try scarf. This is just to show the process of loading in an image. So select that. And then we've got our open image button. Click on that. It will load it in. So the node has changed its appearance slightly. So what we need to do now is just link color out to base color in. So click drag on this little node, drag that across, and the image will appear on our object. So that's how we load in an existing image. Let's disconnect that, move that to one side. Let's add another node, texture, image texture. Drop in the node, and this time we're going to create one. So click on new, get this pop up. Let's name this, so click type Stool. And for IMVU, our images, depending on whether we're using Studio, which we are in this case, we can make this 512 width by 512 height. If we were using Classic, or we were doing this for Classic, one of these would have to be 256. That's the limitation of Classic. 256 by 512, or 512 by 256. So that's essentially that versus that. But we're using Studio, so we can do 512 by 512. So width, height, and then what we need to do is generated type. Click on the list. Let's just go with UV grid. OK. That changes the appearance of the node again. And similarly, drag that across, and there's our image. So we'll do this for the other ones. Get rid of this one. So select. Is it node? Oh, there it is. Delete. So we can get rid of that. So that's our basic material. That's all we need. So we've got principled BSDF, material output. Those are the two defaults. And we've just added an image texture. So we'll do that for the other ones. So select the book, add texture, image texture, drop that in, new. This is book 2. Book 2. Let's make this 256. We're 256. Color grid. Okay. I'll link that across. And then again for book 1. New book 1. We'll say, yeah, so 256, 256, that's okay. Okay. And that. Right, so those are our basic materials. So we started with our basic material assignments, and then to this, in the shading workspace, we've added our images. So this now means we can UV unwrap these before we start painting them. So let's start with this book, seeing though we've got this selected. Now we might need to rearrange our appearance of our layout, but we want to be in UV editing workspace. Click on that. Yeah, so we want to reorganize. So let's create some new plus button, duplicate current, double click, TikTok UV editor. Right, so join areas, and that's what we want. So when we enter UV editing, meshes are automatically switched into edit mode. And this basically means that it allows us to quickly select and make changes to the mesh that are contextually relative to UV editing. So in this case, what that might mean is I'm going to switch to edge select. What this might mean in this case is selecting these inner edges of the book. Let's just hide, yeah, we might need to hide the, go into outliner view, going to hide the mannequins. Let's check that in, yeah, that's gone. Where's our TikTok editor? There it is. So we've just hidden the avatars. So what we're going to do is delineate these inner pages from the outer cover by using a UV seam. So we have to select the edges that we want the UV seam applied to. So that's shift click, and then from the edge menu we want mark seam. Edge, mark seam. Click on that, and it'll highlight the edges that we've got selected orange. So that means that when we unwrap this, this section will be separate to the cover. So if we do that, so to unwrap, select all. Doesn't matter that we're still in edge select mode. We just need to select all, and then from the UV menu we can either do this in the 3D view or in the UV editor. Doesn't matter which. We get a few different options depending on which one we use, but so UV, unwrap. Click on that and we can see that the UV changes. So we've gone from, this is the default, just going to switch into island select so we can, so that's the default, which is based on the original cube that we dropped into the scene to make the book. It keeps that layout essentially. So what we're doing now is essentially disrupting that and redoing the UV relative to the object, the shape that we've now got, which is a book. So let's just undo that. So edit, undo. We've got our mesh selected, all UV, unwrap. So that changes the appearance. So now we've got two sections. We've got the cover. So let's just switch to material preview so that we can see what we're looking at. So this section is the book cover. Press the G key. Just move that. And then this section is the inner. So that's the pages, the book's pages. And that's what we've got, two UV islands, so separate UV sections, pages and cover. But this is a little bit distorted because of the shape that we're unwrapping. It's an awkward, essentially semi-organic shape. It's got curves and all sorts of things. So to aid with that, what we can do is split some of these corners, which forces this inner edge to essentially lay out flat. Because right now everything is joined together, which is creating this awkward shape. So if we do the same thing again, we're still in edge select mode. Select, may need to do it on the corners. So essentially you want to be doing this every time you have a, not necessarily a hard 90-degree edge or corner, but every time there is a significant changing direction, essentially. That's the easiest way of explaining it. So select those edges. So edge again, mark seam. If we unwrap again, this should select all, UV, unwrap, unwrap. It flattens the book out. So that's what we were looking for. Might need to do it a bit more on these very corners of our book. Shift click, edge, mark seam, select all, UV, unwrap. That's gone a little wonky. So it's a question of just playing around with the UV seams just to see what we can get. So which is better? So we've placed those, we can erase them, clear seam. That removes them. select all, UV, unwrap. That's a better shape. We can do a little bit of editing to that. So that's our basic book unwrapped, and that's the basic UV. So what we can do here is edit the UVs. So we're going to use, in a similar way that the 3D view has a set of tools, the UV editor also has a set of tools. So we've got our move, rotate, scale, and then universal, which gives us this broader widget that has a lot of little things on it that we can use, including scale, so that's on the corners, rotate, which was the one we're just using. If you hold down the control key, that snaps to rotational increments and the pixels. Got scale, so that's the edges. What we want to do is do a little bit of editing to this. Tidy it up. UV, round to pixels, corner. What this will do is it'll snap to, let's just get rid of that. It'll snap to the pixels and it'll treat the corner of each pixel of our image as a pseudo grid. So it's essentially a grid in its own right. So UV, round to pixels, corner. So what we can do now is switch to vertex. We can select these vertices and just move them. Use our widgets and edit our book. Just straighten these up a little bit. Move. This may take a little bit of fiddling. Don't necessarily need to straighten everything up, but if we're talking about making a product for other people to derive from, you want to try and take the time to straighten everything up as best as you can to make it easier for people to derive from. That might mean selecting, let's just move that out of the way. That's the pages. And there isn't really a quick way of doing this and maintaining control over the position of the vertices, because we could use these to essentially square up the UVs, but it doesn't always work. So that's our cover. Move that across. There are our pages. So as we can see, as we move our UV sections, we can see what it's doing on our book cover. Inside pages. So that's the book essentially UV unwrapped. But now, depending on how much or the degree to which we want the book to be derivable or customizable, let's say somebody wanted to put some text on these pages. This UV section is quite thin, so it's not really going to allow much pixel space to write anything in there or draw or paint something on this edge. So if we wanted to, we could face select, separate these UV segments like so. Make sure we've got everything selected, select all so we can see everything. We can scale these up. And this gives us, or gives the deriver, a lot more space to work with. But you do have to be careful that you don't give too much more space, pixel space, to certain elements of a UV or a mesh that results in an obvious disparity in terms of, because what will happen when you do this is that you will create an area of greater texture density on one section versus another. So what that means is that these pages might look more detailed than the book cover. So that's the trade-off, and you have to be aware of that when you are doing this. So that's book 1. So let's just crash through book 2 and we'll essentially do the same thing. So tab out of edit mode, object mode, select the book, object mode, edit mode, do the same thing. So edge select. So that's alt click to select the loop around the entire book, shift click for the remaining edges, edge, mark seam. So we want to do the same thing to this book as we did here to these pages. So whilst we're here, we might as well add a seam to split these the same way that we manually split those. So edge, mark seam, and then these edges, let's just view frame selected so that we're rotating around our selection properly. It's easy to work with. Edge, 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 mark seam, select all, unwrap. And there we've got the same thing. So we just need to edit UVs again, move, that's okay. One thing to note as well, when you first unwrap something, the individual UV vertices may not necessarily be snapped to the pixel grid that we enabled. So you might move a selection, it'll snap to the grid, but relative to any neighboring vertices, they may be misaligned. So it's then a question of adjusting whichever vertices are more convenient to move to get everything lined up, particularly on something like this, which is relatively regularly shaped, so lots of square edges. That's that one. Have to concentrate. what we can also do with our image, because we use the grid, is that we can use the actual grid of the image to help with our alignment. Like so. So that's that. Island select. Select these three. Move them to one side. Give us a bit of space. And we can see that that now has our book fully unwrapped. So what we might want to do is just shrink this down a little bit. We don't necessarily want this going right up to the edge, because we might end up with some bleeding issues, anti-aliasing, because we've gone right to the edge of the image. So just scale that down a teeny bit. Hold Control, Shift Control for smaller increments. That will do. So that's book 2. Edit mode, object mode, select seat, object mode, edit mode, and do the same thing for the seat. So select, shift click, select. Now we need to lay this out flat because it's a box. If we unwrap this as it is, well, let's just do that actually. So let's just select it all and just, so that's the default, again based on the default cube. So this is the UV map assigned to the default cube. So if we unwrap this now, it's going to stay as a cube. But what it'll sometimes do, let's just do that again, unwrap. It's going to give us an error. No. Oh yes it did, it just flashed up. So what we need to double check, view sidebar, item, let's go into object mode, just double check the scaling. Needs to be 1 for all of them, that's okay. Right, so close that, back into edit mode. So alt click, shift click, and then shift click 3 of the bottom edges. Edge, mark seam. Now for the underside of the seat, so again this is, when we were working on the book, what we were actually doing is a form of optimization. So this layout is a way of optimizing the UV for better quality in certain areas versus a lower quality in others. So that's an optimization technique. Similarly, but for slightly different reasons, what we have with the seat is this is visible, this is visible, and the top is visible. So the underside isn't necessarily going to be visible as readily as the other areas. Same for the bottom here, but that's an incidental. So what we can do here, because we want to try and optimize as much space as possible that we can get out of the UV, so we unwrap our objects in a way that accommodates that. So this can be UV'd so that it's a separate section that can be shrunk down so that it gives us more area for everything else. So we select the edges, so shift click, mark seam, and then we want the same treatment for the top that we did for the book, because we need these edges to lay out flat. So edges, mark seam. So if we unwrap this now, select all, UV, unwrap, this is what we end up with. So that's our leg. That's the seat. So the sides are part of that same UV, and that's the underside. So we can straighten this up a little bit. So UV vertices, let's just go with using the shortcut keys for speed. So that's G to move, well in this case, so select 2, R for rotate, and then S for scale. So if we had more than one, we can scale. So the same tools or similar tools as to the 3D view. So what we can do here is use the image to get our alignment like so. And just spending a few more minutes doing this will help with derivation. It makes it easy to derive the product. So that's that section. So although we've optimized the UVs relative to making this easy to derive, because this shape, now that it's been squared up, is much easier to paint over than the original, which is slightly narrower at the top. But, and this is one of the things that you need to be aware of when you're optimizing your UVs and your image assignments relative to those UVs and how that fits on the mesh. You need to be aware that in doing this, we've now stretched the texture essentially. So we've now got, if we, and we can see this, if we look at the alignment of the lines, they do follow the profile. They shouldn't, because they should be, let's see if we can do this. Scale. It should be more like that because we've got less mesh space at the top than we do at the bottom. So what this might mean, or a consequence of making the adjustment for making this easier to derive from, is that if someone were to write some text on the sides of the stool, the text is going to pinch slightly at the top than it is at the bottom, which might look odd depending on what they're doing. So that's another thing to be aware of. In terms of, although we can optimize the UVs to make them easier to derive from, when we make these adjustments, we have to be aware of the consequences of those adjustments relative to how the image is then going to appear on the mesh. So that's that. We don't have to worry too much about the bottom. That's included here, but it's not going to be seen unless somebody puts this into a room and tips it over. Let's do the seat. That's kind of unwrapped itself, which is here. That's okay. So the underside, we can shrink that down. Hold Control, make that smaller. So I'll make this the largest element. But we do have to keep an eye on making room for our seat. So we've now effectively got quite a bit of empty space, which can't necessarily be helped in this particular instance. One way to work around that would be to split. So let's do that. Let's try. So it's these two faces. Let's split these off. Select all from these. I want to scale them so that they're scaled roughly the same. Put that one there. Rotate that one around. Hold Control, snap to the increments. Put that one there. And again, we have to play around with the scaling so that we get both on the image without any overlap. So, are we gaining much more by doing this versus keeping the UVs joined together? Drop that in there. So we've gained a little bit of texture density by increasing the size of those UVs by splitting this into sections. But flip side of that is that if someone wanted to do a design that wraps around the stool, we've now made it tricky because we've got two sections. So again, we've got the optimization of gaining more texture space, so more resolution, by splitting that UV section up, but we've lost the ease with which certain types of designs can be painted to the seat because it's now in two sections. So either or, which is going to be better? What type of derivations are we expecting? I'll turn that back round. Or what are we trying to accommodate? Join those together like so. So this is much easier to derive from, although it doesn't give us as much. Let's try shrinking the seat down. And again, we have to figure out which is going to be more important. A detail that's applied to the leg of the stool or the seat of the stool, which is going to be more visible. So do we make the leg smaller and the seat larger? So we're increasing the texture density. So that's the amount of texture that's in a given space. So we're increasing it for the seat, reducing it for the leg, because that's not as visible as this. But that, we'll stick with that, make it easy to derive from. So a pattern is going to be more easily painted on this than it would be if these were separate UV sections to get greater texture density. So there's a lot of things to think about when we're talking about unwrapping our UVs on our meshes, especially if they're items that are going to be derived, because what we're actually doing is unwrapping our meshes, not necessarily relative to what we want to do, but what other people might want to do and how easy it would be for them because they didn't make the mesh. They don't understand the layout of the UV relative to the mesh. So we've got to try and make it as easy as possible to derive from our objects. So now that we've got our, so that's our UVs. Now that we've got these, so we've got our chair or stool, book 1, book 2. Or is that book 1 and that's book 2? Yeah, that's book 2. So that's our UVs. What we want to do now is do texture painting in a separate stream to make it easy to follow. But as we have our UVs now, what we can do is save these as UV maps. These are the things that people will use to help or aid them in painting our products. So for that, we just make sure that we've got our object in edit mode. Everything is selected. And then from the UV menu, UV, and in this layout, it's export UV layout. Ordinarily, this option is down at the bottom. So we want UV, export UV layout. We'll get the standard browser, and then we want to just, so we've got seat, which UV is this? This is for the seat. Seat.mesh brackets UV. So we are saving to a location where we want the file to be saved, giving it a file name, and then our format is generally going to be PNG. There's our size, so it's 512 by 512. The fill opacity, if we set this to 1, what we eventually get is an outline, a filled outline. So that's a shape that's essentially colored with a wireframe. And all we do is export UV layout. Let's just actually rename it. So we've got this sitting seat.mesh. Let's get rid of that seat mesh. So seat UV. So we added sitting seat. So we're going to export 3 of these. So export UV, save. Object mode, book 1. Edit mode, select all. UV, export UV layout. Same again, book 1. UV, sitting, same settings, then export UV layout. So that's that. Select our book 2. Make sure everything is selected. UV, export layout, book 2. UV, sitting, enter, same settings again, and then just export. So we've now got 3 UVs. So that is prep. Let's save this file. Are we using incremental file save? Yes, we are. Save, increment. That's number 8. So that's our object, UV unwrapped. We've saved the UV texture maps. They're just the wireframes of the UVs. And that's ready for the next step, which will be texture painting. Ooh, one thing we haven't done. So these are generated images, the things that are actually mapped to our objects. We don't necessarily need to do this now, but if we wanted to, image, save as, and we'll get the same dialog box, file name, location. The difference this time is that we've got more file format options. Generally speaking, you'll want to go with something that's lossless, and then just save the image. So let's just do that. Sitting sRGB, title raw, so that's book 1, save. So these are the images that we created. Make sure that's book 2. Image, save as, book 2, sitting. TGA. You can use bitmap. Save as. Then the stool, which is larger. That's 512 by 512. Image. Save as. Sitting stool. Save image. So we've now converted what are temporary procedurally generated images, so that's the grid. We've converted those into digital assets. They're files on our hard drive. So now the material is referencing actual image data. So that is now properly set up for texture painting.